but I was able to raise the $1 million. And in fact, I signed a term sheet for $1 million on my 13-year anniversary at Cisco, which is when I submitted my resignation. So I had a lot going on that day. But then I was kind of off to the races.
Welcome to Triangle Tweener Talks, a weekly podcast by builders for builders where we explore the startup journey from the idea to the exit and all the lessons in between with an exclusive focus on founders from the Triangle region of North Carolina. Tweener Talks is produced by Earfluence. Now here's your host, serial founder and general partner of the Triangle Tweener Fund, Scot Wingo.
Welcome to this episode of Triangle Tweener Talks featuring Robbie Allen, serial entrepreneur and my partner at the Triangle Tweener Fund. This episode is sponsored by Robinson Bradshaw, a full-service business law firm with a passion for supporting the Triangle entrepreneurial system. Bank of America, their transformative technology group helps game-changing tech businesses and founders realize their boldest ambitions across a wide range of technology sectors. And Smashing Boxes, a Durham-based lean design-centric design transformation company. And special thanks to our friends at Earfluence for helping produce this podcast. I first met Robbie over 15 years ago while he was at Cisco, and as a side hustle, he had built a generative AI application. That was 15 years ago. This shows you how far ahead of the curve Robbie is. Like many Triangle founders, Robbie comes from humble beginnings. He's from Greensboro, North Carolina, and one of the first folks in his family to go to university. In this episode, we hear his journey from the University of South Carolina, home of the Fighting Gamecocks, to MIT, and how he quickly became a distinguished engineer at Cisco, one of the highest accolades an engineer can achieve. We then hear how he pivoted from working at a big company like Cisco to founding companies. StatSheet, Automated Insights, Infinia ML, and his latest startup, Bionic Health. That's 4 startups in a very short period of time. I hope you enjoy this interview as much as I do. And now here is Robbie Allen.
So I was born in Burlington, North Carolina, which is about 40 minutes west of the Triangle. My dad worked for AT&T in manufacturing, and my mom worked at Haynes Hosiery in Winston-Salem. Mm-hmm. And so a very kind of decidedly manufacturing-oriented household. I like to say I don't think I heard the word entrepreneur until I was in college. So I didn't think that starting companies was something that was available to me at the time. I thought you go and hopefully get into college. I was the first one in my family to go to college. And then the whole point of that was to get a job. And so anyway, growing up, just kind of a typical childhood, we moved around a fair amount because my dad got transferred and we lived in Winston-Salem. We got transferred to Oklahoma during my middle school years. And then my 11th grade year, they decided to move back to Burlington, North Carolina because being small town folk, they thought wherever Robbie graduates high school is where he will live the rest of his life because that's kind of what they did. Yep. And so they thought, well, crap, if he graduates high school in Oklahoma, he's going to live in Oklahoma the rest of his life. So moved me back my 11th grade year. I wasn't very happy about that. But one thing that happened my 10th grade year was I took my first class having to do with computers. It's called Business Machines. And, I didn't know anything about it, but it was one of those kind of magical moments in my life. Pretty early on, when I was in the class, I was like, I want to do this the rest of my life. And so I'm kind of one of the lucky few that got exposed to something earlier in their life and then realized that's what I wanted to do. And so I knew from 10th grade on, I wanted to be in computer science.
Yeah, that was like the IBM PC era, right? Like
that's
they
right.
Just come out.
Yeah, that was 1992.
Yeah. So was that an Amiga? Was it an IBM PC? Just a vanilla kind of? That was right at Windows, maybe. Windows was 90, 91.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and it was IBM Business Machines, I guess is what that was about. And so did that, enjoyed it. And then I knew I was going to study computer science in college. And but just to kind of relate, I wasn't very happy with being moved back to North Carolina because, again, I was middle of high school. And so I applied to 2 colleges, UNC, which I was a lifelong UNC Tar Heel fan. I like to say I came out of the womb a Tar Heel. And I applied to University of South Carolina. And I got into both. Back then it was a lot easier, or they weren't as discriminating as they are now. I got into both. And instead of picking the place that I loved growing up, it was only 20 minutes from home, I decided to pick the place that was much farther from home so I could get out of Dodge. And so I picked the University of South Carolina, which is another thing we have in common. And I went there for my first couple of semesters and really liked it.
Yeah. And then, so did you, after you took that 10th grade class, did you learn to code kind of on your own, or you really didn't do that until you got to college, or did you take like a high school class or something?
Yeah, there weren't many, back in 92, 93, there weren't a lot of classes. I don't even remember, oftentimes there's AP computer science. I don't even think that was available in my school. That might've been like the only computer related class available. And so it was one of those things I was interested. I got a computer at home, but I was mostly just kind of hacking on it. I was for fun. Like, remember the old floppy disk and, all the different types of software you could get. I would go and make copies of those and, try to hack the computer without really knowing anything about programming. That didn't come until I was in college.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So you go to USC, you're in comp sci.
Yep.
At that point, for a long time, USC, the comp sci was in the math department and not the engineering. It was still separated that way?
It's still separated still. And that was not too uncommon in general back then, that math, computer science was kind of a afterthought in the math department.
Yeah. Yeah. So you did a couple of years there?
Yep. And so my high school sweetheart, we met in Burlington. She went to ECU. And so we were kind of doing this long distance thing. She was at ECU, I was at USC. And then after a couple of years, I was like, why don't we just get back together? And, you could either come to USC or I could go to ECU. We picked ECU. And so I ended up transferring to ECU into their computer science department.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So that's school number 2.
Yep. And I have a long list of schools I've been to. Yeah. Turns out I really like the college environment.
Yeah. So you're a Gamecock and a Pirate. So that's a good combo. Yeah.
Yeah. And then,
but the ECU comp sci program at that point was probably a bit of a step down from South Carolina, I would imagine.
It was, although, the funny thing is I've been to, I often like to tell, especially sort of high school students, that I've been to everything from ECU to MIT. And some of the best education I ever got was at ECU, and some of the worst was at MIT, mostly because schools like ECU, they're not, especially ones that aren't known for like deep, heavy research, they're there for teaching. Yep. And so I'd go there and the professors were all into teaching. That's all they cared about. And so the quality of the education was much higher than what you'd get in some other classes where the professors may be a noted researcher or scientist, but they didn't really care at all about the teaching.
Yeah.
And so it turns out for me, the ECU computer science department was awesome. Like, it was still kind of very similar in terms of it was just kind of starting out and kind of rising up above electrical engineering and math. But it was the kind of thing that, the professors there were great. It was a pretty small environment, so I could, get the classes I'd want and get the professors I wanted.
Yeah. And you meet a professor, like I had a professor at USC that just let me do whatever I wanted when he found out I was kind of interested in stuff.
Yep.
He's like, oh, here's here's a login to this system. Go crazy. It's like, wow, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was the system administrator for the computer science lab, so yeah, I had access to all the systems. It was great.
Yeah. Cool. And then did you graduate from there, or you hopped again?
Nope. So when I moved to ECU, I decided I wanted to start doing internships because, again, in my mind, the whole goal of going to college was to get a job. And so I did an internship at IBM in 1996. And this is a kind of full circle, funny situation. So it was at Building 800 at the front, what's now known as the Frontier. That's where IBM Networking Hardware Division was based, which was their sort of old router and hardware business that competed with Cisco. And so anyway, I did an internship there, and that was like my sophomore year. And it went well. And I heard about this company down the road called Cisco, which is literally just, 4 miles away. And they were apparently eating IBM's lunch when it comes to routers and switches and that type of thing. I was like, that's kind of interesting. And so maybe next summer I'll do an internship at Cisco. And so sure enough, another year at ECU, and then I went and did an internship at Cisco in 1997. And that was a crazy experience because Cisco was, it was really kind of their heyday. And at the end of the internship, they took me aside. And at this point, I'm all in on programming. Like, I'm just living and breathing that. I'm, at Cisco, I was sleeping under my desk a couple nights a week. I was, just spending all amount of time doing it.
But that network stuff, you're pretty close to the metal. You're like maybe assembly, maybe C. You're not like much above that, right?
I did all of it. Like, I would build websites internally for their intranet. Mm-hmm. I would do networking programming as well. So I was kind of exposed to all of it. Yeah. And so at the end of that, they approached me and said, this thing called the .com boom is happening in Silicon Valley, and we need programmers as fast as we can find them. And so we'd love for you to, we'd just ship you out to California, and we don't care that you don't have your degree. And you could just work on your degree in your spare time. How does that sound? And so again, I thought, well, the whole point of going to college is to get a good job. And it's like, all right, they're saying I have a good job and I don't even need to finish my degree. I'll just do that. And so I moved out to San Jose, California, and I lived out there during the boom and the bust, which was just a phenomenal time. Again, this was sort of, Cisco's heyday. And again, at this point, I still hadn't really contemplated ever starting a company. I didn't think that was something. I thought I'm going to be at Cisco for my whole career. Let's talk. My dad worked at AT&T for 30 years.
Going from Burlington to San Jose is a big leap in culture.
It is. And, being in California, especially for, I was 21 years old or whatever, Northern California is just great. There's so much to do, so many things to see. So I was just eating all that up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then did you actually buy real estate or did you just rent out there?
So I ended up, my manager at the time, I ended up moving in with him and we bought a condo together. And this was, again, like 2000 or something like that. And now at that time, real estate was doubling like every 6 to 9 months. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't have that much money, but I went in and paid what I could for this condo. And then of course, a couple of years later, it had tripled in value. And so, I was just able to get into something then, which was great.
If only you had kept it.
I know. I wouldn't be here today, Scott.
Could have been your best investment.
That's right.
Cool. So then you're out there, you're through the boom and bust. And I remember the bust was pretty fast and scary. There was the Kleiner Perkins Rip Good Times kind of came out and then, it just was down, straight down. And Cisco got hit very hard because they were giving customers loans to buy equipment. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of kind of stuff that you wouldn't do today, kind of questionable business activity from a lot of, the Enron was borderline, criminal, but even Cisco and those kinds of companies, they ended up getting really shellacked during that time frame.
Yeah. And I remember, driving around the Bay Area is notoriously pretty gnarly. There's a lot of traffic. And I remember one day driving into work, I'm like, you know what? There's not as much traffic today. What's going on? And it was the bust had started. Mm-hmm. And in fact, Cisco had laid off a ton of people. And therefore, a year, the traffic wasn't that bad. And initially that kind of struck me. I was like, oh, I get it now. There's not as many people going to work because they were all laid off. Yeah. And so, it was kind of a freaky time. And that's when I decided, I was like, you know what? I don't know if staying around here is it's a high stress environment. And I thought, well, why don't I move back to North Carolina? I have family here. My high school sweetheart had come out to California with me. She, we're from Burlington. So, it kind of made sense for us to move back. And Cisco is very, easy when it comes to, working from home, or you could work from any of their major locations. And so, we decided kind of right around the time that the bust was happening that would be a good time to move back.
Yeah. And I guess you were never at risk of layoff or anything? You just kind of...
No, I was, continuing to rise through the ranks pretty quickly. Again, I was one of those that was sleeping under my desk several nights a week. And, I'd like to say I got a lot out of Cisco. Cisco was great for me, but I think Cisco got a lot out of me too. I was putting in lots of hours and time and doing some good stuff. So,
yeah. And that was kind of not the norm at Cisco. It wasn't a startup at that point.
Yeah. No. Yeah.
Yeah. Was this the John Chambers era?
It was. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever get to meet him?
I did, but not then. It was only till later. We were speaking at a conference together. This was a couple years ago. And I got to meet him. Cisco used to give out these little plaques, for employee of the quarter or whatever, little awards. And I got a few of those. And so I took one of them with me because I knew he was going to be speaking at this conference and I would get a chance to say hi. And so I took one and had him sign it, and it was from, when I was 22 years old or whatever. And cool. So that was pretty fun.
Yeah. 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 Do you pretend to remember? He's like, oh, no,
yeah. But he was great. He was such an all-star back then. Everybody kind of looked up to him. I always thought he was a great leader in general.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then, so you moved back here and you're still at Cisco, and that's off Kit Creek kind of,
yep.
Were they there at that point?
They were. Yeah. They had been there, since even before I'd started. They'd been there a long time. And, but, something else had kind of happened when I moved back. I decided that, there was a lot of startups, obviously, in the Bay Area, and I got to see that happen. A lot of them start and fold. And I started thinking, I got to meet a lot of entrepreneurs. And I was like, I don't know. I think maybe I could do that too. I don't know if that's something that, like I said, is unattainable for me. And I started advising other startups. And so that kind of got this bug in my head. A couple things. One is I thought that starting a startup was something I could potentially do. And then also I started to really see the warts of being at a big company. We were so big at that point, 90,000 employees, especially after, things started to come back. And my calendar was just wall-to-wall meetings every day. Mm-hmm. And it was just painful and, just lots and lots of project managers scheduling meetings. And then you have people that are just there to manage the meetings that are being scheduled. And it was just like totally unproductive. So I became pretty cynical about the effectiveness of big companies in general. And so that was the other thing that was kind of eating at me, is like, I think I could do it better, if I could start my own thing.
Yeah. Sometimes, and then also Cisco started to kind of lose their way a bit, right? So they missed the whole software-defined networking thing by a lot, and then they had to acquire all their innovation suddenly leaned into acquiring things. Like they couldn't self-innovate, which is kind of a sign that they're kind of trapped in an innovator's dilemma. And then they bought like WebEx, which didn't make. I mean, knowing the pandemic was coming, it would have been genius, but that wasn't really. It was just like a reason to sell more networking, like trying to create demand for networking. I don't know. It didn't make sense to me from an outsider's view.
Once you get to that size, as you know, like in order to, an Apple and all the Microsoft, all these companies have this problem. Like once you go to a certain size, in order to kind of get to the next level, you can't just have a $1 billion business. Like you got to have a multi-billion dollar business, right? Yeah. And so the bar is so high for them to add meaningful revenue to their business that they have to start doing crazy stuff. And again, this is where these big companies, I think, act unnaturally in most cases once they get to that size, because like it's just almost impossible, maybe not possible, except in just a few rare cases, or something like AI comes along that kind of boosts or juices your ability to innovate, that, they're just out searching. It's like, all right, WebEx, we're going to do telepresence, we're going to do all these things, just to hope that something hits, that we can get to our next level of revenue. Yeah.
Okay. So you're sitting there enjoying the Cisco life to some degree, but you're seeing the cracks in the wall. Then what happened?
Well, as any good engineer that's interested in startups would want to do, I thought, if I'm going to go start a company, I need to go learn how to be an entrepreneur. Mm-hmm. And so how do you do that? Well, you go take a course, you go, read the book, and not knowing, of course, that the best way to learn about being an entrepreneur is by doing, not by reading a book. And so but I didn't know that. Again, I'm an engineer, and so we go and read books for things. And so I thought, well, what I'll go do is take, maybe what I'll do is go back to school, because that's also another answer that I typically kind of resort to in a lot of cases. And so, but at that point, I still hadn't got my undergraduate degree. It had been, 8 years in.
Did that bother you, or you didn't care?
Didn't bother me. I didn't really care, because and I knew the classes I needed to take weren't like classes that are meaningful. Yeah. It was, whatever. It was
probably like 5 or 6. It wasn't like Herculean either. Yeah,
that's it. And so I thought, it sucks. Well, another thing had happened during this time. I'd started writing books, and so I got to know the folks at O'Reilly Media, and I started kind of editing books for them, and then I got named a co-author for a book. And I liked it. And in fact, what I found was that's a really good way to learn about a topic, is to write about it. Mm-hmm. And so at Cisco, it's kind of this virtuous cycle where they would say, okay, Robbie, we need to redeploy our DHCP infrastructure, it's the way that IP addresses get allocated to devices, for those that aren't familiar, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with DHCP, right?
Yeah. You see the field and you're like, oh, that's scary. I know I don't want to mess with it. Yeah. If I have to mess with it, stuff's going down.
And so, or they say, Robbie, we need to redeploy DNS throughout all of Cisco's infrastructure. We want you to be point for that. And I'm like, I don't know that much about DNS. And so again, what I would do is go and spend a bunch of time researching it. But then I found if I started writing about it, that's a good forcing function to really learn about it. And so what would happen is typically it would coincide, with Cisco saying they wanted me to do a project, is then I would go to O'Reilly and say, hey, you don't have a book on this topic. How about I write one for you? Yeah. And I don't have any.
Did you get to pick O'Reilly's famous for having fun animals on the covers? Did you get to pick your animal?
You don't get to pick. You don't get to pick.
What were the animals on your book?
So, I wrote 10 books. And so I got a bunch of animals. A whole zoo. There's a baboon. There's a tuna. There's, all different kinds of things. There's a cat. That was on the Active Directory book.
So you just casually wrote 10 books. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So, 10 books in about 5 years. And so I was just cranking those out. And again, that was kind of filling so as I was working 80-hour weeks at Cisco, but then eventually I was kind of like, I don't know if it's worth spending 80 hours a week at Cisco. So I started trying to find other things to fill my time. And so writing books kind of was like my, 20 to 30 hours a week. And then Cisco would get 50 to 60.
Yeah. Have you ever done the hourly profit on writing a book?
No. You would never write a book.
It's like $3 an hour.
It's maybe worse. And then there's the opportunity cost with your time and all that.
Yeah. It's really good for branding though.
Yeah. And then I started going on the conference circuit and started speaking at a bunch of technical conferences and doing all of that. And so that was all good and well. But like, again, at that point, I still hadn't had my undergraduate degree. And now I want to go back to school and get my master's. But one thing is most programs kind of require an undergraduate degree before you get your master's. So I went to UNC and Duke and asked them, hey, would you accept me into your master's program if I don't have an undergraduate? Now, I've done all these other things. I've written books. I've doing these things, speak at conferences. Would you allow it? And it sounded like that they were open to that, that they could make an exception, that if I just, I was really close to finishing the degree, but, because I've done these other things, maybe they'd let me happen, let me do that. And then my wife, one day pulled the kid card. So we hadn't had kids at that point. And they said, okay, Robbie, you're going to get all this way. You got like 4 classes to finish your undergraduate, and then you're not going to complete it. You're going to quit. And I'm like, oh, gosh, you pulled the kid card on me. That's not fair. And I was like, you're kind of right. If I finished my undergraduate, then I could just apply to anywhere. I could go anywhere I wanted, really, or I could apply to anywhere. And so I decided to do that. And so I talked to ECU. They said, okay, I could transfer to another place. And by the way, in intervening years, I took classes at NC State. I took classes at San Jose State, took classes at Stanford. So
to chew away at the undergrad piece. Okay. So you weren't like a full year behind, maybe half a year or something by that point.
And then with ECU, like I could transfer them all to UNC, but again, I'd lose some credits and it would take longer. And I was like, well, I could just buckle down and take these 4 classes at ECU. Most of it would be remote. I'd only have to go there on occasion. So I'll do that. And so that took like a year, and I went ahead and knocked out the undergraduate degree. The great thing about that is, again, I can now apply to any college, right? Because I don't have to get an exclusion.
So you're officially a Pirate.
I am. That is one of my affiliations.
And now you love Pirate basketball more than UNC basketball.
No, that's never changed. I've always been pro UNC when it comes to sports. And so as a computer science person, one of the places I'd always kind of aspired to go to is MIT. And so I applied to MIT. They accepted me. And so I talked to Cisco, and they let me work part-time while attending MIT for a couple of years. Mm-hmm. And so I did that. Was this a master's or like a
master's?
Yeah. And it was they had I wanted to do kind of a joint thing with the engineering program and the business school. And so they have an engineering management degree that was essentially that. And so I did that. It's called System Design and Management. SDM is the name of the program. Highly recommended. And so I did that and commuted between here and Boston for a couple of years, and really enjoyed that. That was 2004, which is right when the Red Sox started winning world championships, which was fun. And just had a great time. And, it was pretty early on. I took I think it was called New Enterprises, was like one of their first entrepreneurship courses. And I was like, oh gosh, why I don't know why I thought I needed to take this course to learn how to be an entrepreneur. It didn't work. But anyway, so I did that. It was an amazing experience for a few reasons. One is they would bring in people to speak at lunch, and they had all these different, just amazing people give talks. One that was noticeable was the guy who invented the Crest spin brush, which is one of the first, economical spin brushes for toothbrushes, and he made $300 million by putting a toy motor in a toothbrush. Yep. And that was essentially his innovation. It's like, I don't know, there's all these very expensive, spin brushes, but what if I made one that was super cheap? And he was a toy maker, and he thought, well, I'll just put a little toy motor in and see what happens. And he sold it to Crest, and I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. Yeah. And then, people like Peter Diamandis, who was an MIT alum, that gave a talk. Mark Cuban gave a talk. And so one of the things I heard pretty consistently from a lot of these entrepreneurs was that you really want to be passionate about the business that you're starting, because the going is going to get tough and you're going to want to quit. And if you're not really excited about what you're working on, then it's going to be really easy for you to fold up shop. And that resonated with me because, again, anytime I could get passionate about a topic, whether it's writing books or whatever I was doing at Cisco, I'd spend whatever time necessary to be successful at it. And so, that's a little bit controversial advice, which we could get into. There's, by definition, there's not that many things that you're passionate about that are great business opportunities, right? And so, like my 10-year-old son, I love him, but he's not a great business opportunity. There's, I like UNC basketball, but that's not a great business opportunity, or maybe it is. And so that's kind of what I started with. I'm gonna make a list of what are the things I'm passionate about. And the list consisted of 3 things. It was doing interesting things with data, web programming, and UNC basketball. And so this was 2006, just finished graduating from MIT. I ended up getting 2 master's degrees. I had taken enough courses at the end of it, they said, well, Robbie, if you just take, 3 or 4 more classes, you can get a second master's. I was like, cool. Yeah, I'll do that.
So it was like what, comp sci and a business thing or something?
It turned out it was actually civil engineering.
Wow. So you can build a bridge too.
Yeah. I probably wouldn't put me in charge of that, but at least I have the degree. And so I came away and I was like, all right, I'm going to start a company now because, I got this fancy degree and I should know how to do it. And so I made that list up and I thought, what would be interesting is no one had really done a lot of stuff with sports statistics on the internet at that point. Mm-hmm. And I figured, if I could get access to that data, there's all these questions I have about UNC basketball. Like, do we really have, typically play a team that goes off against us from the 3-point line, right? And they do better than average just against us. They perform at their average for most games, but for some reason we have outliers on a regular basis.
Our referee's really biased.
Our referee's really biased. Mm-hmm. Are the preseason polls as really bad as we all think they are? Are there people that are perennially overrated and underrated in the polls? Things like that you couldn't find answers to. And if I had the data, I could answer those questions. And I figured, well, I had those questions about UNC basketball, I could build the website in such a way that, for any team, you could answer similar questions. And so that was the beginning of StatSheet, mm-hmm. which was the kind of very first thing that I built. And this was, again, I was still at Cisco. I came back, to North Carolina full time. And, at that point, once I had the degrees from MIT, they made me a distinguished engineer, which was their top technical position. And it's great because it's kind of like a tenured position at a company. I mean, not to say that you're bulletproof, but like you can get away and you have a lot of job safety if you're a distinguished engineer.
Yeah. Probably get to do a lot of big thinking around architecture, not as much doing, not as much sleeping under the desk.
And they bring you in, and this is kind of another story I'd love to tell is that, every engineer, when you start, your goal is to be, if you're ambitious, is to be a distinguished engineer, right? Mm-hmm. Like at Cisco, they were the cream of the crop. A lot of the people that were distinguished engineers and fellows were the people that wrote the protocols behind the internet. Mm-hmm. And so just huge impact. And so you kind of aspire to be that. And so one day, they brought me into my manager brought me into the office and said, Robbie, congrats, you're a distinguished engineer. And I'm like, oh, that's awesome. Something I've been working toward 10 years. What does this mean? He's like, oh, just come into work tomorrow. I'm like, oh, okay. But like, I don't know,
there's no ceremony.
Yeah. There's no ceremony
there's no watch. There's no nothing.
Yeah. What do we, do I get up on stage?
Something. Yeah.
And so, is this, that was a realization of like the 10 years it took me to attain that goal. What was way more fulfilling was the 10 years, not the point at which you actually achieve the goal. And so that was informative for me in that, any company I ever started after that, a key value is enjoy the journey. Mm-hmm. Don't wait or hope that you're just, going to have some big exit or you're going to have some amazing end result, because that's pretty fleeting, actually. The thing you need is to have a sustainable and enjoyable path to get there. And that was the thing, even for me. Again, I was super fortunate to get to that position at Cisco, but like I just had so much fun along the way. That was way more important. So anyway, I started StatSheet kind of nights and weekends. And so again, I have this kind of spare 30 hours. I was tired of writing books at that point. And so I thought, well, I'll start a company. And so I started StatSheet and, worked on that for 2 years or so. Mm-hmm. And it got to become pretty popular. Again, this was 2007 and 2008. I started adding more sports. I started with college basketball, but then I started getting data for college football and the NFL, NBA, baseball.
You probably had to go scrape the data, I imagine. Like, did you have a pretty sophisticated web crawler for this data at that point?
So there's a couple things. One is some data there's no providers for, especially like historical data and that type of thing. But for like the standard box score and especially any kind of real-time data, mm-hmm. actually I started from day one going and getting it licensed, mm-hmm. because my thinking was, if I build this up and someday it's very successful and somebody wants to acquire it, and if I say, oh, all the data I scraped from somewhere else, that could be viewed negatively and may impact my ability to partner with other people or get acquired. And so I was like, you know what, I'll just bite the bullet and do that from the beginning. And then it also helped that I applied for an NC IDEA grant, mm-hmm. and I won. And that was like in year 2009.
Yeah. Was it 50K back
50K,
then?
yeah.
Still 50K.
And the funny thing is, I applied the year before that, And this was back when it was Word documents that you fill out.
Yeah.
And I misread the limitations. It said like, only, max of 300 words or 300 characters. And I did words or I did, whatever. And so I blew out the limitations and they automatically disqualified me because they said it was too long.
You're a writer. You're going to write?
I know. And so they said, well, just apply again next year and make sure you follow the rules. And I was like, okay. And so then the next year I was able to win, which I always, I thought was amazing. I've always been a huge fan of the NCID grant program because like how many states can you get a grant? That is, they don't even take equity and they're going to give you $50,000.
Non-dilutive. Yeah.
To me, that was a great deal. So anyway, I did that. That kind of paid for my second year of operations with, paying for stats and hosting and that kind of thing. But then, it was pretty obvious to me that I was all in on StatSheet. I really enjoyed doing it. My interest in Cisco was kind of waning. I was just like totally done with the big company politics. And
what did they think at Cisco when you were working on this? Did they think it was crazy, or they?
Well, they didn't really know too much. I mean, I told my manager at one point I had a sports stats website I was maintaining, but a lot of engineers would have little side projects like that, so it wasn't a big deal. But again, it was mostly something I did outside of the purview of Cisco. It wasn't like impacting my job. But I was interested in it enough. I was like, I need to move. And just focus on that. And so I decided if I could go raise some money, then I would leave Cisco and focus on StatSheet full time. But I was not completely sold on it. And so I did what a lot of entrepreneurs or budding entrepreneurs do, is to go around and try to talk to some people to get advice. Mm-hmm. And then that's when I came across this guy named Scot Wingo.
Yep.
And again, this was probably 2007 or 8. When we first met, and you
probably not 2008. I was probably depressed in 2008. I would not have been a positive entrepreneur.
Is that right?
the great. Well, towards the end of 08, it was like the great financial crisis was upon us.
That's right. I think it was before that.
Yeah,
because you were very positive. I was like, hey, I think we met at a Starbucks, of course, and it was, I told you the story, and you're like, yeah, you should leave Cisco and just go start your thing. I'm like, I don't know, but like I got this great job, and like who knows, if StatSheet will be successful, and you're like, oh, you'll figure it out, and I'm like.
We also you had received acquisition offers, if I recall, from like, ESPN or EA or like, and you were like, and then your traffic was like, your MAUs were just like up and to the right. It was crazy.
Yeah. ESPN had made overtures and invited me up to Bristol. That was kind of a pretty fascinating time. I got to be at the ESPN desk and got my picture, as if I was.
To me, it was like so obvious. Like you had lightning in a bottle, but you're like, yeah, I may just like stay at the same time. Like most people die for this thing you've created, and you kind of have just like not stumbled upon it, but you've figured out something. Yeah.
Well, and if you think about it, though, I was very brought up risk adverse, right? Like the idea of starting your own company. Again, the whole point was to go and get the stable job that you work at for 30 years and then take retirement, right? And so for me to kind of deviate from that was a pretty big deal, but. Again, at that point, I was confident enough that I'd rather make the bet on me. A lot of people, and I used to write a lot about this because, people love to associate working in a big company with safety. And like, it's the less risky option compared to going and starting a company. And I've done both. And I always thought that staying in a big company is actually riskier on a few fronts. Like with a startup, at least you have some direct influence over your ability to control your situation. At a big company, I mean, again, even though I was a distinguished engineer, I knew of other distinguished engineers that got laid off. Like if they, especially with Cisco at the time, occasionally they would lop whole departments and whole divisions, right? And maybe in some cases they give you the chance to reapply internally for a position, but in other cases they just will let go of the whole department. And you have no control over that, no ability to influence.
Yeah, we had people leave Channel Advisor to go to Cisco because it was more stable, and then get laid off 3 months later, and then and then try to come back. Yeah, no.
And then there's these other issues that I often talk about that your network, your personal network atrophies over time, your skill set atrophies over time. And again, you're in this kind of small little bubble. Typically, again, inside of a big company, you have a small network of people. You're talking, and you're kind of working on this kind of very specific thing, and so you're not out talking to people of different areas or different companies that often. It's all kind of within the same thing. And so why it's so risky is, let's say, after you're there 15 years or 20 years, which I know a lot of people that are still at companies like that for 20 years, and then you get laid off. And then now look at your prospects there. Well, you better hope that whatever that little thing you were working on that exists at some other company? Because if it doesn't, like it's not exactly transferable to many other places.
Yeah.
And then your own network has also atrophied. You've not been out like talking to people that maybe could potentially hire you at a different company. And so I think it really sets you up. While it may seem safer in the moment, I think in the long term, it's actually much more risky.
I think this AI wave is a really good example of that, because I'll go talk to people at big companies and they're like, what are you excited about? I was like, oh my gosh, this AI stuff's crazy. I've been doing this. They're like, oh, we're not allowed to use it. And their mindset is they could use ChatGPT like when it first came out, and then there was an edict not to. And that's kind of like when their knowledge 2 years ago of AI stopped. And, maybe sometimes they're a little bit curious, but, it's hard when you have a job. You're not going to go, you're unique in that way that you spend an extra 20 hours doing stuff. Not everyone does that. And, I think that's going to be the biggest skill gap that a lot of people at big companies have in this next, 3 or 4 years. It's going to be interesting to see how they navigate that.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So you decide. So how much money did you want to raise? Do you remember?
So one of the challenges, I'd written a bunch of code at that point for StatSheet, and what I didn't want is to go raise some money and go hire one other engineer, because like at that point, like I said, I'd started adding support for lots of other sports. Adding one engineer, that wasn't going to move the needle for me that much. I needed to hire like at least 3 or 4.
Yeah.
And so, I kind of came up with the number. If I could raise $1 million, that would make it worthwhile for me to lead the safety of Cisco. And really I could make a good effort at, taking StatSheet to the next level. And this was in 2010, back when $1 million seed round was, a pretty big number. But I was able to do it. I found the right firm that was interested, specifically the partner at the firm who later became my COO, Scot. Great guy. He was also very into sports, and he's a Dookie. I'm a UNC guy, and so we always had healthy banter about that. But I was able to raise the $1 million, and in fact, I signed a term sheet for $1 million on my 13-year anniversary at Cisco, which is when I submitted my resignation. So I had a lot going on that day. But then I was kind of off to the races.
Yeah. Was Cisco freaked out? Did they try to keep you, or?
I told them what I was doing, and of course they would make overtures and say that they want to keep me, but like there was just nothing nothing that they could do that would make me want to stay.
Yeah. So you're still StatSheet at this point, and then you've raised $1 million and you start going at it.
Yep. And so we did that for a year and a half. And, StatSheet was a consumer internet company. And especially back then, typically how you build those to scale is that you really don't focus on revenue in the early days, because you need a lot of eyeballs to be able to get to the point where you can have, you could turn on the spigots that would generate revenue. Mm-hmm. And so what you often would want to do then is not put barriers in place for adoption. Because again, you're wanting to grow your user base as fast as possible. Because you have to get to tens of millions of users. If you don't get to tens of million users, you're not going to be able to get enough revenue to make it worthwhile anyway. And so turning on revenue when you only have 100,000 users didn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Again, to me, it's kind of crazy logic. I mean, that was the way that
today we call it PLG, product-led growth.
Yeah, but mine was even worse, because the way that you monetize is through advertising.
Yeah.
And so that was that made it even more challenging. I mean, it was kind of Twitter was doing the same thing at the time, so you could kind of point at that and say, "Oh, that's the way we're going to do it." And but the problem is, sports statistics in general is not a huge segment of the internet. A lot of people think sports, wow, that's such a big category. When it comes to actually internet viewing, it's not that big. Mm-hmm. And the biggest problem is it's pretty big if you aggregate all the sports together. But if you look at any one sport, it's just not that big. And it suffers from seasonality. That is, college basketball is great essentially for the month of March. Mm-hmm. Outside of that, it just doesn't get nearly enough eyeballs to make it meaningful. Yeah. And that tends to be the way it works around most playoffs for those sports. And so what happened was I had to start supporting lots of other sports so I could fill in those gaps of seasonality throughout the year. So anyway, that kind of reared its ugly head when we were trying to figure out, all right, how we raised $1 million. Now we're going to have to raise a Series A, and we're going to need to at least be able to tell a good story about how we're going to get to some sort of revenue. And it just was looking like that was going to be a hard pitch. Mm-hmm. And so what we decided kind of at the point of raising our Series A was, all right, we're going to actually stop doing the consumer piece, and we're going to switch and take this technology we built, which we haven't talked about yet, and turn it into a B2B company. And again, this was pretty unusual at the time that at the point we were raising our Series A, we, changed the mode in which we were going to try to get revenue. That is from a consumer to B2B. And we even changed the brand of the company. It went from StatSheet to Automated Insights.
Yep.
And really the core technology that I had built at that point was this notion that if I had all this data, I could automatically generate narrative out of it. And so the way I would talk about it is I wanted to compete with ESPN. And ESPN, if you look at them, they really have two main assets. They have video rights, which they pay billions and billions of dollars for. I can't compete with that. But then they have all these personalities that write content. Mm-hmm. And that I thought, well, I could possibly compete with that. In fact, I could probably have a lot broader coverage than they do if I had access to all the data, because then I can write about every team, just not the most popular ones. So I could have the long tail. If you remember back then, long tail was a very hot kind of mode in which people were trying to say, well, you got all the people focused on the big head, but if you looked at the long tail and you were able to get to that, mm-hmm. That would maybe even be bigger than just the head. And so I thought, well, I could do that for sports. And so anyway, developed this technology that would take in, say, a box score of a game and then look at a lot of historical data and then generate a recap of that game automatically. And it was really the notion that if you had all this data, I can summarize the data in narrative form. And so that was the thought that, well, what we could do is just take that core idea and apply it to business, because lots of businesses had data. And in fact, the era of big data, which was a buzzword at the time, was really starting to take hold. But people didn't know what to do with all this data. They were told you need to collect all this data, and so they started collecting it. But then eventually they were like, so why am I collecting all this data? What am I going to do with it?
Yeah. And then maybe they put up a dashboard, but a dashboard's not super interesting. It's not actionable.
And it's the problem is with the dashboard is it's very passive. Like you have to go to it. You have to decipher the meaning. I often say that, dashboards require you to be a data scientist mm-hmm. at a certain level. And at least for executives, most executives aren't data scientists. And so wouldn't you instead just rather have a sentence that said, hey, your sales are down 33%, but don't worry, it was the same way, Q3 of last year. Versus you having to like kind of look at the chart and say, okay, actually I see the trend and this is what's coming out of it. And so that was the bet, is like, all right, let's take this technology. We refer to it as natural language generation. That's kind of the computer science-y term. There's natural language processing, NLP, which has been around for a long time, but then this kind of more emerging field called natural language generation, or NLG. Now we call it generative AI. Yeah. But essentially what we were starting in 2011 at that time was one of the first commercial generative AI companies.
Mm-hmm. But you weren't using an LLM per se, but you were, you were, what was interesting though, and ultimately I was on your board, so I know a lot about this story too. So, what was interesting is every article was unique and you could personalize it to the person, right? So if Robbie was going to get an update, it would be largely Tar Heel basketball and then maybe like some other things going on of interest, like maybe in the ACC or something. Whereas, someone else that's interested in the SEC, they would get very custom kind of thing. So it was very unique in that way. The other thing you did that was really smart was, and I don't know if this was intentional or not, but then, the journalists in the world started to realize you were creating robot writers. So there's a lot of really interesting dust-ups around, are you going to put all the journalists out of work? And, is this ethical and things? And part of being a startup that's hard from a marketing perspective is just getting attention. And if you can do something kind of controversial, it's an attention magnet. I don't know if you enjoyed the attention at that point.
We did. In fact, it was
leaned into it at one point and started writing about it pretty aggressively and joking about people and things and things. Yeah.
It was awesome. What I found was journalists are the ones that are in charge of what articles are being written. And if you have something that they view as potentially a threat to their job, then they were happy to write about it. Yeah. And so we got covered in like the Thanksgiving edition of New York Times one year. We got Wall Street Journal, just like a lot of early stories where it was kind of a robot hand holding a pen. Mm-hmm. That was, for whatever reason, they really, gravitated toward that. And so that was one of the things we had going for us in spades as Automated Insights, was like we'd have all this press coverage, pretty easy.
Yeah. And then did you shut down StatSheet altogether at that point, or it still kind of just did its thing?
Well, this was kind of a controversial thing internally. So, even though I had done, I probably wrote 90% of StatSheet at that point, I was in favor of just shutting the whole thing down because I thought it was a distraction, but it's one of these things, and this is one of the hard things about a startup, is if you have something that's just kind of like a decent amount of success, it's really hard to turn it off because you're like, well, I don't know, some people say they really like it. And so we're really going to turn off something that people like. And the answer is, yeah, if it's kind of not core to your business and it's distracting you from the thing that you should be focused on, then you should shut it down. But it was super hard for us to do that internally because, for years, that's what we were known as. That's what we had developed and what we had built. And again, around these playoff parts of the year, whether it's March Madness or whatever, we get this huge influx of traffic. And so I was pretty much in favor of shutting it down, but I lost that bet for a few years just because there were more people internally said, it's not going to take that much time. Let's just leave it up and running. Mm-hmm. But in general, it was kind of an afterthought at that point.
Yeah, there were some assets there. I remember you had a lot of Twitter accounts for every sports team, and like the SEO was all through the roof because it was just like very SEO baity because it was like so much content you could create websites for.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that we did was we created a website for every team. And so I was a big believer in team-based coverage because that was my whole story, right? I like college basketball, but really all I care about is UNC basketball. Mm-hmm. I watched Kentucky beat Duke last night and I enjoyed that. But in general, I just care about UNC. And so I only wanted UNC coverage. And I thought that's how a lot of people kind of think about sports. And so what we did was, again, we were trying to automate a lot of this coverage and we thought, what if we just built websites for every single team? And so we literally had 1,000 websites. Then we had Twitter handles, the API, they had an API at that point that allowed you to post content automatically. And we thought, well, what we'll do is just generate a Twitter-sized version of a recap and do these things. And so we had Twitter handles, we had Facebook pages, we had websites, we had all these things. And we even started doing mobile apps, or at least mobile websites for all the teams. And that was kind of a fun experience. We even created little logos for every single team, which got us into all sorts of copyright and trademark issues. But
sometimes doing something controversial is good.
Yeah.
So you're into this narrative thing, and then naturally you're in sports, but then you started to get a lot of inquiries into I remember franchisees would come to you and say, or franchisors and say, I'll make one up. I'm Subway, and every day I send this big data dump to 3,000 restaurants, and none of them read it. And we think that they would prefer a narrative kind of a model. So it's really interesting that kind of started with sports, and then you ultimately did a cool sports deal we'll talk about, but you started to find other applications as well.
Yeah, and that was intentional. And one of the challenges, it's great to do something new. And for a lot of my career, in starting companies, it's been a new thing, a new market. And that's exciting to get behind because not many people have done this thing before. The challenge is you're having to educate the market, right? And so we had to spend a lot of time, people didn't know this capability even existed, that was possible. And then we'd go in and say, okay, here's some examples of, we took this data and when it generated this. And I remember it was yesterday, the most common response was, someone would read it and they say, okay, so who wrote that? I was like, well, our technology generated. It's I know, but this is somebody wrote this article. I was like, no one wrote the article. And it's we'd have this debate about they didn't believe that technology could possibly do that. Mm-hmm. Right. And so that was a big hurdle.
Yeah. Yep. So then somewhere in there, you had a situation where one of your early investors kind of wound down or something, right? They disbanded and you had to kind of go fix that. That was kind of a mess.
Yeah. Yeah. We had one of our, the firm that had done that original seed investment wound down and, weren't supporting us in future rounds. And that was at the time, one of the arguments against doing large VC-led seed rounds was the signaling problem. Mm-hmm. And that was if you raise a large round or, you raise money from a VC and then they don't come in for your Series A, then that's a signal to everybody else that we didn't think enough of them to continue to follow on. And then maybe that could tank your ability to raise more money. That was generally, why a lot of people wouldn't do those kind of deals. But again, for me, I was, I wanted to bet on our ability to be successful. Now, again, that firm ended up winding down and they didn't support us. So we were going through that exact problem. But, I won't say it was easy to get the Series A done. And again, we were doing all these changes. I look back on it now, I'm I don't even know how we were able to pull it off because again, we changed the company and the model. And then we didn't have our seed investor supporting us. And we, the executive team had to go, I don't know, it's probably 3 or 4 months with no salary. We had to defer salary because we were just running up on the end of the money before we were raising the Series A. And then, there was still the aftermath of the financial crisis that happened too. So anyway, it was a stressful time.
Yeah. And then you ended up getting your A. Who led that?
So Court Square Ventures, which they're based in or was based in Charlottesville, and so they were in that, and then we had a number of other VCs that came in as well on that one.
Yeah, you remember the early guys didn't know what to make of you.
Yeah,
they didn't like the consumer part of what you were doing for sure. Yeah, and they didn't understand the AI, the automated insights part at all.
No.
Yeah. Yeah, no one knew. They're like, okay, it felt like a toy to a lot of people because what do you do with this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
but they hadn't been in those meetings where people were like, oh my gosh, if I could send this to 3,000 of my franchisees, this would be way better than forcing them to log into a dashboard they don't look at.
Yeah, that's right. And so it was a lot of hurdles. Again, there were only a couple of us in the business doing that kind of thing back then, and so it wasn't like we were competing against Google and in general, there was less noise on the internet, so we could get a lot of attention that way, but it was still a struggle to educate the market.
That was interesting. You had a company in Chicago called Narrative Science, if I remember, and they were going at it. You were kind of going after different verticals, and they were going after the newspaper industry. They were going head on, basically saying, use this instead of the AP or something like that. Yeah. Yeah. Whatever. Oh, we'll talk about that later. Okay. So you're chugging along, and then you did your big deal with
Yahoo.
Yeah.
Yep.
How did that come to fruition?
So again, it's these kind of lucky turns of event that you can never plan on. But we actually talked to all of the big sports companies, sports news companies, Yahoo, ESPN, the NFL, because we had this thought that, where better to personalize sports coverage than fantasy football? Fantasy football was really big, still is big, and people would devour any content they could create. So imagine you had your own personal recap of why your team beat my team and the great moves you made or whatever. That might be a way to kind of keep engagement high for these fantasy platforms that were all just duking it out, trying to get as many users as they could. So we went to Yahoo, and it was actually the GM of Yahoo Sports, David Geller, who I'm still friends with today. He took a chance, and it was like, yeah, let's do this with Robbie. And it was so funny because I still was good friends with the head of ESPN Digital, and I went to him and said, "Hey, we got this thing we could do automated recaps for your tens of millions of fantasy people. They would love it." And he told his team, and ESPN was famously an NIH, non-invented here type of company, where they only wanted to build internally. They never wanted to use partners. Mm-hmm. The head of ESPN Digital told his team, "I want to do this with Robbie," and we still never could get it done. And yet with Yahoo, David Geller, he was able to make it happen. And so we actually got a contract done through him. And, one of the great things that we said is we wanted to have a byline in the footer. So at the very bottom, we just wanted to say, powered by automated insights with a link back to our website. And so sure enough, we got that done. And it was just this huge boon for the company because pretty much for 14 weeks of the year, we'd send out 10 million of these recaps. Well, guess who plays fantasy football? A lot of business people.
Yeah.
And so they would see this recap, and the feedback was, universally they loved it. And at the very bottom, it said powered by automated insights. You click on the link, go to our website. And so our traffic was just from September, through the end of the year was always amazing. And it sent just so many people our way.
Yeah, I remember it was very stressful though. So Monday Night Football would have to happen. And then after Monday Night Football, the machines would do their magic so that and there was a pretty hard deadline where they wanted it all delivered by
the next morning
at 9.
Yes.
So you literally had, less than 12 hours to generate 10 million unique narratives.
Yeah. And they had to send all, there were so many points of value. They had to send us all this data. They had to do all their own computations because they had to calculate points and things like that. They had to send us all the data. Then we had to generate all of the content and handle, again, there's 10 million of these recaps, all the different permutations and errors that could come out of different things. And so, yeah, that was super stressful.
Yeah, many sleepless Monday nights, I imagine.
Yes. And we called them work late nights where we'd have people come and, we'd stay till 1, 2 in the morning.
Yeah. Cool. And then and that actually had revenue with it too, which was very nice. Yeah, that was a really big, they paid you quite handsomely as well. That was awesome.
And then we, at the same time, did a similar deal with the NFL. So the NFL network, we powered their fantasy football recaps, which is pretty cool. We got to go to the NFL headquarters. And
so you're chugging along, you're doing all this, you've done your Series A, and then you started to get some acquisition kind of nibbles. Yeah.
Well, first we always kind of got different inquiries, over the years, but then we raised our Series B, and that was in 2014, summer of 2014. And
who led that one?
That was Osage out of Philadelphia. And
so at this point you raised $1 million. What'd you do on the
I think that was 4 and then 5.
Yeah, so 10 million.
Something like that, a little over 10. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what had happened just before we raised our Series B, and this is often why I tell entrepreneurs that you have to just be able to hang around long enough for the confluence of events to line up in your favor that would, help you either get to the next level or get acquired or whatever. Well, what happened was that summer, Stats Inc. got acquired by Vista, which is one of the large private equity firms, software acquirers. And Stats Inc. was at the time, the number one sports data provider in the world. And so they were the big one. That was, when I told you in 2007, I paid for my sports data, it was actually with Stats Inc. So I'd had a bit of a relationship with them over the years. And so they got acquired. Well, the private equity model is, once they go and make a big acquisition like that, they want to then go out and find who else can they acquire to help prop up or improve, the ability for that big acquisition to get to the next level.
Yeah, they call it a platform play. They buy the anchor platform and they glom a lot of stuff onto it.
That's right. Mm-hmm. And so one of the reasons I liked the sports, the digital sports space to begin with was there weren't many companies that were innovators in that space. In fact, there weren't a lot of companies. Now it's partly because it's hard to monetize. But what that meant is there weren't other companies really out there, to compete with, cool new stuff I was building at the time with StatSheet. And so
one competitor wasn't doing sports. Narrative
right.
science was like doing I don't know, like business articles or something. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't remember what they were doing. Yeah.
And so when it got to be 2014 and Vista acquired Stats, it was pretty much still the same environment. That is, there weren't a lot of innovative sports companies out there. And so when I can imagine the internal conversation they had, which was like, all right, now that we've acquired Stats, who else are we going to acquire? And there's like maybe 3 or 4 companies on the list. And one of those companies is, Automated Insights, they used to be StatSheet and they still do these fantasy football things. Maybe we should go talk to them. And so we had just completed our Series B that summer. This is 2014. And then by September, Vista, contacted us and said, hey, we'd love to talk. And so, I just raised our Series B. We had new investors that were super supportive. And I was like, we can talk because I believe in keeping your options open, but it's nothing that we're all that interested in right now.
Conventional wisdom is when you raise a round, there's this window of a year, you can't really sell the company because you've jacked, that investor's expectation is a big return, and you've got to kind of execute past that to even get close to an exit. Yeah, that's
right. And so I was like, I don't know if we should even look at this, but we thought, it's Vista, and they're known for being pretty aggressive acquirers, and so we thought, at a minimum, we need to have the conversation. So I flew down to Austin and met with a bunch of the partners, including Robert Smith, the owner, and that meeting went extremely well. And I gave him the whole pitch on, why the future is narrative and not dashboards, and, how we can automate this kind of analysis and present it in language form versus just presenting numbers. And I saw Robert look over at one of his guys, and he kind of gave him a nod and a wink. And I was like, ooh, that looked like a good sign. And so we left, and we went back, and then sure enough, they wanted to give us an LOI and make an offer. And we were like, we just raised our Series B. The bar's going to be pretty high for us to consider anything because we got new investors. And they said, let's see if we can figure it out. And so, as they say, they made us an offer that even our new investors couldn't refuse. And the way they like to pitch it is look at their IRR. Right. Yeah. Their IRR was amazing. I still think that we had the best IRR for them out of any company they've had because they only had us for 6 months. Because
they had a time component. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cool. So you sold the company.
Yep.
Yeah. Have you ever disclosed a range of kind of what that was, or?
Well, what got reported was 80 million. And so I won't confirm or deny that.
This was one of those, 100%, not like a sell 51%, roll a bunch forward kind of thing.
So I rolled some forward. And so it was kind of a sweetheart deal, frankly. So they said, Robbie, you're kind of, they did that. We were acquired through Stats because they needed the platform. Their model was you acquired. But what they told me is they want us to work with all their portfolio companies because, again, all of their portfolio companies were data companies, and they were trying to figure out what to do with their data, and maybe Automated Insights could help them.
Almost seems like a PE firm would love to use this internally. Imagine getting, instead of this big book of financial data, just get a narrative for each company generated.
Yeah, they said, how about this? We'll just you continue to run the company, and you won't be a part of we won't subsume you into Stats. You just kind of run it independently as you have, and then we'll make introductions to all of our portfolio companies, and and, we'll give you some more capital. And so I was like, wow, this is great. So yeah, I'll do that.
Yeah. Did they have a vesting kind of on your shares? Like you had to kind of stick around for, 2, 3, 4 years?
They did. Yeah. They did. And so it was like, I rolled forward, some percentage for a couple of years. But yeah, it was still a great result.
Before we go into the life after private equity, when you started Automated Insights, you were one of the few first-time founders and even multi-time founders that spent all this time on culture. Like where did that come from, and why did you do that?
It's a great question. And it was from my time hating the culture at Cisco. It was, like if I looked at it, and again, I learned that lesson about it's the journey, not the destination. And, I'd had a couple of experiences. I'd been pretty lucky in my career to work with good people, but there was a couple times where, I worked with somebody that was just completely, one person could just completely zap the productivity and even just the overall happiness level of a team. I was like, I do not want that. Like if part of the benefit of me going and starting a company is I can kind of mold it to be whatever I want it. And what I want is to be an environment people enjoy coming to work. Yeah. And so to me, it was in many ways, it was kind of a selfish thing, as well as like, it makes sense for the business for people to enjoy. I never kind of believed that people operating under fear would necessarily do better, or, especially if you think about it sort of post 2010, it was really starting to become a very competitive environment for talent. It was hard to keep people around. And so I thought, well, for us to be able to compete, we're going to have some cool technology to work on, but we really need to have a culture that people enjoy working at, because they're going to get offers for other places. And so why aren't they going to take those offers? Well, hopefully it's because they liked working with us as well. Yeah.
So I remember, you had an office at American Tobacco, and it kind of overlooked the baseball field, which is cool being a sports company. You were like, right, yeah. You had the whole sports thing. But you would walk in and there's definitely a ping pong table, maybe a foosball table, maybe it was shuffleboard or something. But then like you also had on the walls like a bunch of vision statements. Like how did you what was the culture like statement that you had? And did you do like culture values? Like how did you I think this is kind of interesting for folks to hear.
Yeah, it was mostly values were the focus. So we had over time, and one of the things I kind of learned was that it's hard to grow the culture over time, because you tend to want to add things to it, not take away. And so we started off with like 4 values, and then it went to 6, and then it went to 8. And then I remember standing up in meetings and I would be like, okay, I want to review the values. And I get through and I'd be on like number 6 or 7. I'd be like, and I'm forgetting what's the last one? I can't remember, and it's like, all right, maybe there's too many. If you can't hold them in your head and repeat them that easily, then you have too many. But really they were all just kind of statements around like, what are we optimizing for? What is it that, automate everything? That was one of our values. And it's like, I kind of thought about it. If somebody's sitting at their desk and they're like, all right, I got 5 things I could work on. What do I pick? Like you should be able to run through the values. And it's like, okay, that gives me a good guidepost of how to prioritize what I'm working on. As well as, another one was no jerks. That was, because again, kind of getting to this point of, I don't care if you're, I always said, I don't care if you're a rock star engineer, I wouldn't take you, if you're a jerk, because we don't need that, right? That's not you're going to end up hurting more than you're helping. Yeah. And I don't think we're going to be successful because we got the one person that just knows how to, that can work 80 hours a week. For us to be sustainable, we need a whole team effort around this. And so it was really, these kind of different values focused on different parts of the culture and what we were trying to optimize for when we were hiring people.
Yeah. And I remember you had like these epic ping pong tournaments and there was like a whole thing there that the whole team was very competitive with each other, but in a fun kind of way.
Yeah. And I believed it was good to have an environment that people, again, kind of enjoyed. It wasn't just about work. It was also, getting up and moving around a little bit. And we might have overdone it at Automated Insights, because there was points in which I was like, I don't know, they seem to be playing a lot of ping pong. But we had people that would stay really late too. And it's like, all right, if they're here 12 hours and they play ping pong for 2 hours, we're still coming out ahead, Yeah. But it got to be pretty bad. One of my really good friends, Adam Smith, we were, this was in one of our first offices. We had a foosball table, and foosball is really loud, right? That's one of the things about it. But we had it in our main conference room, and we were interviewing like an engineer. And so the people were interviewing them in that conference room, and Adam and I were like, well, let's play foosball. If they can't handle this while they're being interviewed, then this isn't going to be the right place for them. And so we were like playing, it was loud, and they're trying to talk during the interview. I was like, I don't know what we were thinking, but it's kind of funny to think back on that.
Yeah. Yeah. Another interesting thing about automated insights is a lot of people have gone to be entrepreneurs themselves. So that's one of the great hallmarks of an entrepreneur is if you kind of get other people into the world. So Adam has Wrangle now, and then is the other Adam? He was in automated insights. So two Adams.
Yeah, Adam Long.
And then who else?
He's got something called Hemingway, which is a writing app.
Yeah. And then any other folks?
So there's a bunch that went on to other companies that have also
because your marketing folks and your finance lady, that may have been, I always get confused with Windsor Circle. That may have been, but you had a lot of really good folks that have stayed in the community and done really cool things. Yeah. Okay. So Vista's acquired you. Now you're working for the man. How did that go?
It's funny because I always remember hearing about, people that would stay 1 to 2 years before, post acquisition and they leave. And when Vista made me that deal about like, you just keep running the company the way you want to, and we'll give you more money to run the company. I was like, that sounds perfect. Why wouldn't I just keep doing this? But sure enough, after 2 years, I was like, I don't know. I think I'm ready to do something else. And so there's something about that, whether it's loss of ownership or, you're not exactly in control in the way that you were before.
Yeah.
That after a couple of years, I was like, you know what, maybe, and for me, I'd started StatSheet in 2007. And then it got to be 2017 or 2016. And I was like, it's a pretty good run.
10 years in. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not, another big thing that I coach, especially early career people on is I don't believe in staying somewhere 30 years. I think that's the worst thing you can do. I think it's okay if you're just cool coasting and like, again, you don't really, you're not too worried about the consequences that we talked about earlier where, you're losing skills and network and all of this. And maybe one day you get laid off after 20 years and you're kind of left holding the bag. I believe it's good for people to change up every 5, 6, 7 years. And that's across a bunch of different aspects. I mean, especially in your career, it's good to change things up pretty dramatically every 5 or 6 years. And so I'd been, running StatSheet and automated insights for, going on 10 years. I was like, that's a good run. It's probably time for me to try something else.
Yeah. Cool. So you come out of there and you decide you go back to your old playbook. And what do you do?
Yep. So I was like, well, what am I going to do in my sort of mini retirement? At that point I was, 40, early 40s. And I was like, well, I can't just retire. I'm got to be too active for that. And, but I'm not ready to start a company yet. And machine learning's really taken off. That's something I'd studied, a long time ago. And, there had started to become more sort of interesting developments there, just in terms of how neural nets had progressed and machine learning models were really starting to show some improvement. And I thought, well, what would be cool is if I went and worked on my PhD in machine learning and how about I do it at UNC so I can finally answer that question I get at dinner parties all the time, which is, what year did you go to UNC? And I have to tell the whole story again about, I got in, but I didn't go and all that. So I applied and they accepted me for the computer science PhD program at UNC. And I was, living it up. I'm on Franklin Street, getting coffee, going to classes. And of course I'm the old dude in the class, but I was really enjoying it.
Yeah. So you're decided to get a PhD at UNC, and then what happened?
Yep. So pretty shortly into that, the head of research at Duke University approached me about starting a machine learning company. Mm-hmm. And again, I was a pretty hard sell on it because I was doing what I wanted to do.
How did you know? So you're at UNC, but the Duke guy, how did that work?
Well, so, they were wanting, so what had happened was Dr. Larry Karen had a large lab of PhD data scientists at Duke. And turns out Larry was one of the 10 most published researchers in the world on machine learning, him and his lab. And so again, this machine learning was really starting to take off, specifically deep learning, which was kind of a relatively new form of machine learning where you apply, more complex kind of parameters and data to these models, and they could automate more stuff. They could automate more complex processes. But
these are neural nets so they're inferring kind of the connections between whatever the data is and stuff. Yeah. So they're learning. Yeah.
Yep.
And then this was, so at the time, a big seminal moment in the AI world was, you had the whole Watson beating Jeopardy, but the more interesting one was when DeepMind, the Google DeepMind people, when they won it Go. Mm-hmm. That was like a big, I always hear AI people talk about that. Was that the same kind of a learning models kind of thing?
It was. I mean, that happened a little bit later than when we started. I think that was 2017 or 18. But yeah, it was the same kind of thing. And there had been a lot of kind of developments before that, one called AlexNet, these other things where it could predict what a picture was. There had been a lot of advancements happening in that space. And so there was kind of two different areas. There's image-based processing and then text processing.
Yeah.
And both of those are kind of happening in parallel, but both showing kind of, lots of interesting results. And so,
all right. So this dude calls you.
Yep. And so he had this large lab of data scientists and PhD data scientists, especially if they were publishing at these, high-end machine learning conferences, were getting $1 million a year from Google and Facebook and some of these places. And so they were very, very prized in the industry. And at Duke, they had a whole lab full of them. Mm-hmm. And so the idea was, well, why don't we take this expertise and go apply it to the business world? Because we don't know, there's this new capability now where we can automate processes that previously couldn't have been automated because we have these complex machine learning models, and we can throw, now that big data has been a thing for a lot of years, companies have enough data that we could train the models on, and maybe we could automate very valuable processes. But going into it, again, they were an academic lab. They didn't know which ones to start with. And so the idea was, well, why don't we just go out almost like a consulting company and do a bunch of projects? And then after a year or two, we could kind of look around and see which ones stuck or which ones that we think were the most valuable and go productize that.
Yeah. And these kind of deep learning models do better if there's a known, an end result, bidding bidding on ads, and you want to pay this, and you got a sale, so like an endpoint, so that you can kind of feed that back into the model, right? Yep. So a zero sum game of winning, and then understanding the implication of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's especially back then, it was more of the training data, which is given this input, this is the output that you want, versus something like autonomous driving, which is like it's almost more free form, and you have to figure it out as you go. Yeah. And so they wanted to go start this company, but they needed a CEO to run it. And there was just a short list of local CEOs that had done anything related to AI, and I was on that list. And so that's why they approached me. Mm-hmm. And so, it was something I wasn't exactly sure of it initially, because again, I was having a really good time at UNC. But this was, I kind of viewed it as a once in a lifetime opportunity just to have the kind of quality team that we'd have. We also got backing from a private equity firm. So a private equity firm was going to put $10 million in if we could get this all situated. Mm-hmm. And so we'd have the capital. We'd have
this dude that's like one of the most published people.
One of the most, at the time when, it's probably peak value to have somebody like that. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, maybe this is worth giving a shot. Totally different. Again, my previous company, I was the technical solo founder, right? And so I was used to developing the technology and running the company. And I'm kind of coming in after they'd already thought about starting the company. And I wouldn't in fact, they probably wouldn't want me coding because compared to these other PhD, I don't have my PhD yet, right? They already have theirs.
Yeah. Did they have an engine already?
No, or there was essentially
it was just
nothing,
more
really.
Conceptual. Here's how you apply this technology to a problem. Okay.
Yeah. And so that's how Infinia ML got started.
Cool. And what year? So this was
2017.
2017. Okay. Cool. So then give us the quick summary of how that went.
Yep. So, long story short, machine learning doesn't generalize well. And what that means is we did a bunch of interesting projects. In fact, we got one done with Walmart, which I kind of view as sort of a resume item just because it was so difficult to get projects done with Walmart. They're notoriously difficult. But
did you go to Bentonville and see that whole situation?
Yeah. Which is pretty crazy.
Yeah. Did you return your pencil at the end of the meeting?
Yes. So we did a bunch of projects, some with the Department of Defense, just all different kinds of projects, Kroger, different things. And after a couple of years, we were having a board meeting, and the private equity firm that was on the board along with me was like, okay, so a couple of years in, money's going to run out. I mean, these projects we were doing pretty profitable, but we had a lot of, 15 PhD data scientists that were very expensive. Yeah. So the burn was not trivial, right? And so we were burning, and there was going to be an end to the cash. And the question was, well, what do we, the whole reason to bring me on was to build a product, right? I'm not a consulting CEO, I'm a product CEO. Mm-hmm. And so after a couple of years, we sat down and said, all right, well, what product are we going to build? And, I had to kind of bring the harsh reality that, well, we've done a lot of interesting things, but nothing kind of is rising to the top that we should go build and focus all of our efforts on that. And they're like, well, that's not great. And I was like, well, this is where we're at. And they said, well, how much money will you need and what can you promise in a year from now? And I was like, well, as Jeff Bezos says, we are in the wilderness and I can't really promise a whole lot of anything in a year. I mean, we're methodically going through all these different applications of it, but unfortunately, deep learning is highly sensitive to data variability. And what that means is you could have the exact same application for automating a process in two companies, but if the data is off just a little bit, then it kind of invalidates the training that the original model was based on. And so what you need is pretty much this exact same kind of data. The example I like to use is facial recognition. That you can train one model, you can go apply it anywhere. And if you trained all on faces, it doesn't matter. You can apply that in lots of different ways. But if you're talking even sales data, unfortunately, sales data can vary and does vary between every company. Just the semantics of it, how they use it, what the lead.
So you couldn't take the Walmart thing and apply it to Target because there was enough differences that it had to be bespoke for every. You had to go retrain the whole model, basically a wipe, restart kind of thing. Yeah.
That's exactly it. And so, after that, to me, it was pretty clear it was going to be a while before we could figure that out. That wasn't kind of what I signed up for. And so I said, it's probably best to find somebody that could kind of run this more as a consulting operation until you really find a product. Yeah. And so I said, I'll stay on as an advisor and continue to help the company, but I'll step back. And so we agreed to that. It was lucky timing for me because this was winter of 2019. And then, COVID happened like 4 months later and pretty much everything shut down. But at that point, I was no longer the CEO. And so I didn't have to run a company during the pandemic, which was, again, good for me, but, hard for a lot of other people.
Yeah. Were these machine learning things pretty compute bound? Did you have to have your own bank of GPUs or could you run it on AWS?
We did need, and we had our own local GPUs, but we also use cloud as well. But that was certainly a factor.
Yeah. Interesting.
But we weren't like we weren't trained.
Bought Nvidia stock.
Absolutely, but we weren't training on like internet size data, right? Like a lot of people make a lot of how much compute's needed. That's because they're training on so much data. You could do at the time we only needed a few Nvidia machines, and you could actually train a reasonable model on quite a bit of data. Mm-hmm. It's just when you're talking internet scale, that's a whole nother ballgame.
Yeah. Cool. And then ultimately they got acquired at some point.
Yeah, Experian. Acquired them a year and a half, 2 years ago.
Cool. And is the professor still there, or is he back at Duke doing his thing?
He's back at Duke now.
Cool.
From last I heard.
Yeah. So then we're in the pandemic, and then you decide that's a great time to start a health company.
Yep. Well, me and my wife homeschooled our kids during the pandemic and traveled. So we were like, we always wanted to travel Europe for an extended period of time. My daughter's 17 now and my son's 10. So the time was kind of running out that we could make that happen. And I was always in a startup or a company. And so we thought, well, if we're ever going to do it, now's the time. And so we homeschooled them and traveled Europe for several months and had an amazing time. But then coming out of that, I was like, all right, now I'm ready to start a company. I need to get back to doing something work related. And so that's when I started thinking through what I wanted to do next. And this time I wanted it to be a little bit different. I'd gotten into my own personal health quite a bit over the last several years, just focused on, trying to stave off some of the things that, I was seeing around me, whether it's friends and their parents having issues or, just somebody like one of my daughter's best friend in like fourth grade, her dad, it was a Sunday night. I remember like it was yesterday. So she was in fourth grade. And what they said was the friend's dad was walking around upstairs and they were downstairs kind of getting ready for, the coming school week. And all of a sudden they heard a loud thump. And they're like, what's going on with that? They went upstairs and the dad was dead. He's like 40 years old.
Holy cow. Yeah.
And just died of a heart attack. Mm-hmm. And it's like, wow, that is crazy. And obviously, she had two small kids and now she's got to, go without, the dad being around. And so that was traumatic. And, just seeing things like that, I was like, there's got to be a better way to tackle this than what my yearly physical, where my doctor really doesn't do much of anything. And yet I'd been following people like Peter Attia and Andrew Huberman. And sure enough, there's a lot of new research and studies coming out showing there's actually things you could be doing now to help so that you could be healthier for longer. Mm-hmm. And the problem was there's not many doctors around that can help you on that journey. And so,
And like anything on the internet, there's always conflicting data.
there's conflicting data. You really needed somebody that's a physician that's trained in that to help you understand what to do with it. But then also there's all this data, and I figured there's a lot that machine learning could probably do to help you understand that data. Mm-hmm. And so those kind of came together, and I approached my co-founder, Dr. Jared Pello, about starting a new preventative health company. And I couldn't do this on my own. I considered, I think being a solo founder is the ideal situation if you can make it happen. But it requires, you understanding the market really well. You kind of have to be able to check all the boxes, for the company. And that's not always easy to do. And in this one specifically, like it's a health company where we were going to actually be providing care to people. I'm not a medical doctor. And so I needed somebody that had that understanding. Well, fortunately I did. And my good friend, Jared, who I had actually worked with, several years before when he had his first startup called iScribes. Mm-hmm. And I was his independent board member. And I kind of, oversaw that as they were acquired by Nuance Communications, and then that got acquired by Microsoft. And so Jared had been at Microsoft the last couple of years. And so I approached him, and we met at the Starbucks off of Slater Road. And I said, hey, why don't we go start a company together? I hate to see you waste away inside of Microsoft for the rest of your career.
Yeah, and iScribes was interesting because it was natural language. Like, you could, that's what Nuance had, Dragon something.
Yeah, Dragon.
Yeah. So that was like a interesting. So he kind of already was primed to talk about AI stuff in an interesting way.
Yeah, and that's why he asked me to join his board back then. Was just because I had that experience.
Mm-hmm. Pretty cool. Did they raise money or was that bootstrap?
They had raised money, a little bit.
Yeah. It's funny, they kind of like were off on their own. Like a lot of people don't remember them as part of the Triangle startup scene. So you start Bionic Health, and then what, for folks, like what's the idea?
So the idea is we provide proactive healthcare for busy professionals. And so what does that mean? Again, fortunately, I don't have to, this one doesn't require a lot of education like my other companies did. Yeah. It's, I just say, do you enjoy the yearly interaction you get with your primary care doctor? And almost, everybody I come in contact with says, we don't really do much. I see them for 10 minutes. They do a little bit of testing. And I said, well, there's actually a lot more that you could be doing now. And if you've ever had, again, a parent go through something and, they just aren't in good health when they're in their 70s or things like that, odds are there's things they could have done in their 40s and 50s so that they were healthier then. And we know those things now. They didn't have the benefit of that knowledge back then, but we know that now. And so what we do is provide a physician-guided process to help do the testing and help you put together a treatment plan so that we can extend your health span, which is the number of healthy years that you have.
Mm-hmm. And then is that a thing that you guys came up with, or that's like a known kind of the Peter Attia guy, or how we say it, he did, or like how is your healthy lifespan kind of determined?
Yep. So it's it's kind of been growing over the last, I would say, 10 years. Again, it's been a little bit on the fringe, but now it's become way more mainstream. There's a book that Attia wrote called Outlive that's super popular. And if you've read that, then you totally understand what we do. That's essentially the embodiment of what we provide at Bionic Health. And now there's starting to become other companies that are doing that. One of the nice things about the healthcare space is it's not a winner-take-all market. So just because somebody else tries to offer a similar service in another location doesn't mean it necessarily takes away from our ability to do that, because there's so many people that could benefit from the application. But yeah, it's still it is early days. So it's not like, we have to educate the market in that some people are still stuck around the idea that, well, I get my annual physical from my primary care doctor. Isn't that enough? And it's like, well, no, that's not enough. And there's quite a bit more that you could be doing. And it really just depends on how much you want to try to extend those healthy years.
Yeah. Another thing that kind of stinks about our healthcare system is it's all geared towards when things go wrong, and nothing preventative, right? So if people want to do this preventative stuff, it's usually out of pocket, unfortunately. But usually you can do it without, most of it's lifestyle changes.
Yeah.
So for listeners that are interested in this, what are like 4 top things people can do to extend their healthy life?
So there's 3 things that, 3 options that you can look at to help you improve some aspect of your biology. First, there's lifestyle change. And so that's eating healthier, working out, sleeping better. Obviously, those are the kind of fundamentals. There's supplementation. And so, helping kind of supplement areas where you're deficient in certain nutrients or vitamins, that can certainly help. And then the last is medication. Mm-hmm. And then, we've seen, everything from GLP-1s to hormone replacements to other things that help reduce cholesterol and chances of cardiovascular disease significantly. There's a whole bunch of things like that that's available now, kind of depending on where you're at and what aspect that you want to try to improve.
Yeah. So to get started, people go get some blood work, and then you guys analyze it and you kind of say, here's your roadmap for improving this.
That's right. And we just start with blood work, and that's where most physicians kind of start and stop today. But there's a lot of additional testing. And, as you know, with our experience with the Tweener Fund, I'm kind of, any sort of diagnostic that can help collect data on your biology, I'm a sucker for, because, it's not just blood. I mean, obviously blood's probably the most, informative and the easiest one, but then there's also things like DEXA scans, which is a full body composition scan that tells you your lean mass versus fat mass. There's things like continuous glucose monitors that analyze your glucose over time based on what you eat and how that impacts things. So there's lots of devices now that help you understand your biology and what you do and how it impacts that.
Yeah, one thing that so on the All In podcast, they talk about there's a company that will do this full body scan. That's really expensive. It's like thousands of dollars.
Yep.
But you can go get this relatively inexpensive calcium scan, and it looks at your arteries. So tell folks about this one.
Yep. So there's there's kind of this order. If you go and say, you've only ever done the typical annual physical, maybe your cholesterol is a little bit high, but you don't know like how bad it is. You can get a calcium score, which kind of gives you a rough guide of if it comes back non-zero, that means you have some sort of buildup going on. And if it's non-zero, then you need to get a CTA, a CT angiogram, which is actually something that looks more specifically at your main arteries to see is there actual blockage or not. And those are all relatively inexpensive and pretty straightforward to get. Now, again, the part of the problem is you go into your primary care doctor and you say, hey, I want to go get a CTA. They're going to like, you're fine. You don't need that.
Yeah.
Or you're like, I want to get a DEXA scan. Why do you want to get a DEXA?
That was my experience too.
And so it's, it's like you said, it's all about sick care. It's all about reactive. It's nothing about proactive. They're not trying to help you look around the corner. Our healthcare industry is great if you get sick or you have something that hurts. But if you're okay otherwise, then they're not going to help you. Yeah. One of the best examples I have is actually came from me. So when we first started doing this testing for Bionic Health, obviously I'm customer number one, right? The reason I wanted to start the company is because I'm into this stuff. And so anything that we do, I want to try it out. So we did the full blood run up on me, and it came back that my ferritin levels were high. I was like, ferritin, well, what is that? I don't even know what that is. Good levels are below 200 and mine were over 900. And so I was like, that's not good. And so after digging in on it, what it means is ferritin is your body's predisposition to store iron. And so what happens is some people store iron, which is a necessary thing that your body needs. It's a part of your blood. But you don't want to store too much of it because, too much iron is really bad for your organs. Well, what happens is if you have a condition where you're storing too much iron over time, you won't manifest any symptoms for years and years and years. But then you turn 60 one day and all of a sudden you start having organ failure. And then they discover, you have too much iron in your blood. And we need to chelate it, which means extract the iron out of your organs. And that doesn't
sound fun.
That's as pleasant as it sounds.
That sounds like Wolverine getting his skeleton.
Yeah, probably looks something like that. But then, at that point, it's going to be very difficult. And so this is something that with a $10 blood test, you can find out if you have a predisposition to that when you're in your 40s and then start doing something about it. Or you can wait until it's too late, right? And so sure enough, I found I had that. I started donating blood. That's kind of the only way to lower your ferritin. And I just actually had my last blood check a couple of weeks ago, and my levels are down under 100 now. So I went from warning zone to totally safe.
You've been donating blood like crazy?
9 months. You can only do it every 8 weeks.
Yeah.
But I've been doing it every 8 weeks for the last 9 months.
Wow.
And by the way, donating blood is actually really good for a lot of reasons. It's good for your body. It's good for other people. But that got me down, and now I'm in the safe areas. And again, that was something I'm just walking around with it. You're not manifesting symptoms, right? Yeah. Your primary care doctor is not going to think, I want to test that just to make sure. Yeah. But again, that's one of the problems.
Interesting. And the other thing you do that's kind of interesting is you publish all your personal health data out there. It's kind of a lot of people would think that's kind of weird, but
and they do, and I don't exactly know why, to be honest with you. For me, so if we have success stories, one of the challenges in healthcare is like getting people to talk about, my hormone levels were at 100 when they should have been at 500, and now we got them up. And so I was thinking, well, I don't really care if people know about my data. And so why don't I just publish all of it? And so if I have, anything I can talk about, I can show it. So if you go to bionic.robbieallen.com, it's a Google sheet with all of my data, and it's all my wearable data, my blood data, body composition, you name it. I don't know of anybody that has more data publicly than that, even the Brian Johnsons of the world and all of that. I doubt they have as much data publicly available as I do. But I don't see the downside to it.
You've taken extreme transparency to a whole new level.
That's right.
Yeah. Do you also do like the 23andMe stuff to look for markers and genetic side?
I have. So I've done whole body genomes, not through 23andMe, but we're
one of those.
So with Bionic, we actually offer, you can do whole body. Not whole body. You can do whole genome sequencing. Again, all of those different areas where whether it's looking at your blood pressure, looking at your body composition, looking at your blood, looking at your DNA, we want to offer something so that people can do that under the guidance of a doctor. So yeah.
Yeah, cool. And then the other thing that's interesting about Bionic from a software perspective is you have a clinic.
Yep.
Yeah. Do you get to wear a white coat and have a stethoscope?
Only at Halloween. Yeah. So the last 2 years, I've dressed up as a doctor, and you can imagine people just love that. They love me coming in as a doctor. But I'm Dr. Allen on that day. But otherwise, I don't play a doctor.
Yeah. And then that's over in Chapel Hill.
Yeah. So we don't have like an in-person clinic per se. Everything's done virtually.
Okay.
Right. So we do everything virtually. Yeah. There is one thing that we offer. We have a performance module that we offer where you can get a VO2 max test. You get strength testing and kind of plot that out on a longevity curve to see where you're at, if you're on track to live to when you want to be. But everything else is done virtually.
Yeah. What's VO2 max and why should people care about it?
Yeah, it's your ability to process oxygen under high loads. Mm-hmm. And it's one of the best markers to assess, how long you can live. Mm-hmm. And it drops precipitously over time. Obviously I'm a big proponent of testing frequently, and frequently can be different for different people. But, one of the things that we found, especially with the much testing as I'm doing, is people think you go and do your annual physical and I get the blood done and like my data point is at this level. And you think, okay, and I'll come in next year and my blood is at this level. And so it must just be a straight line from there to there. When actually it kind of depends on the biomarker. Some of them are more stable than others, but others, especially when it comes to hormones, they're bouncing all over the place. And so it's actually a fallacy to think that they're just connecting, the dots or the actual trend of how your biomarkers are performing. You need to do more frequent testing to see throughout the year, how things are trending.
Yeah. Cool. So you founded 3 companies. You're obviously, I started the Tweener Fund and I got in over my head and I was like, you had kind of said, if I can never help you, let me know. And it's like, I need help because it ended up being bigger than I thought it would be. And we had to invest a lot more companies. So it's been fun working with you on that as well. What's your top kind of advice points that you give other founders when, the other thing that I appreciate is you spend a lot of time with, first time founders and you're always paying it back, which is good. When people come to you and, what are some of the top learnings that you share?
Yeah. And I appreciate, having the opportunity to work with you on this. I mean, sometimes I'd get questioned, especially from investors that, I'm talking to about Bionic. They're like, oh, but what you're doing with this Tweener Fund thing. And my answer is always the same. My side hobby is just to meet with entrepreneurs anyway. Like I meet with entrepreneurs almost since the day I met with you, right? Like I think you set a great example back then about meeting with this guy out of a big company to talk to him about something he may want to start. And I really get a lot of energy from it, talking to entrepreneurs about their idea and, hearing the passion. And so regardless of whether I was doing Tweener Fund or not, I was going to be meeting with entrepreneurs, right? And so when we started talking about the Tweener Fund, it made a lot of sense for me because I was doing angel investing, but not very well. I was just kind of scattershot. I was meeting entrepreneurs, but maybe not feeling like I could have the impact. And the Tweener Fund afforded me the opportunity to really focus my efforts around this movement you were creating around, let's create something Triangle focused that can not just be providing advice, which of course we do, but then also even some capital and visibility. I mean, that's increasingly something that I hear a lot of the portfolio companies enjoy is that, when we talk about who we're investing in at the end of the quarter, they get a little bit of lift from that. Mm-hmm. And so in general, that's just been great. And it's been a great outlet for me to be able to do that. In terms of the main advice I give entrepreneurs, it tends to be the people that, very early on, just like with me, I don't really believe in regrets. But if there's anything I would have done differently in my career, is probably started a company earlier. I just didn't think it was something that was accessible to me or something I could do. When now what I think is anybody could be an entrepreneur. I don't really believe it's a DNA thing or like there's some people. I think you can learn the skills. It kind of depends on the type of company. I wouldn't say everybody's meant to go build $1 billion startup kind of company. That requires a very specific mindset and skill. But in terms of starting a company, I think virtually anybody could do that. And it's really just a mindset thing. And so it's just a matter of, do you have the ambition to do that? Do you have the will and as Hubert Davis says, the coach of the UNC basketball team, the will and the want to. And if you have those, I think anybody can be an entrepreneur. And so what I spend most of my time doing is alleviating the concerns people have. Well, what if, I'm going to leave my nice cushy job. And I was like, well, it's maybe cushy now, but maybe you're too safe, and kind of working through all of those things, because I think it's a viable opportunity for just about anybody, to the point that even with my kids, what I told them pretty early on was like, I'm not going to have a college fund for you. I'm going to have an after school fund. And you can use that money in one of two ways. You can either go to whatever college you want to, and I'll pay for your undergraduate, or you can go start a company, and I'll be your first investor, and I'll help you start the company. Now, my daughter, she's not going to take me up on that, but my son, maybe we'll see how that goes. But I think
it's a little Peter Thiel experiment.
Yeah. That's right.
N equals 2.
Yes. But I think even at 18, you could go start a company, and college will always be there. You could go to college later. I don't think it has to be then, and again, it kind of takes the right personality and all that. I'm not saying everybody should do it. I'm saying everybody could do it if they wanted to.
Cool. Well, thanks for being so generous with your time. I know you're busy building Bionic. Good luck with that. It's going to be exciting to see the outcome there. And thanks for joining us today.
Yep. Thanks, Scott.
For more Tweener content, check out the Triangle Tweener Times Substack at tweener.substack.com. For more Tweener content, check out tweenertimes.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon on Triangle Tweener Talks.